Tonight, something happened that Russian officials had spent years insisting could never occur. Not a symbolic incident on the edges of the battlefield, not an attack on contested ground, but a deliberate, calculated strike carried out deep inside the Russian capital itself. In the early hours before dawn, while most of Moscow slept believing the war remained far away, Ukraine reached into the very center of Russian power and made the conflict impossible to ignore. This was not chaos. This was not an accident. This was intention made visible in fire and shockwaves. For years, Moscow had been treated as a sanctuary, a place insulated from consequence while destruction unfolded elsewhere. That illusion fractured in a single night. Explosions echoed through districts long considered untouchable. Fires burned close enough to the Kremlin to be visible against the skyline. And for the first time since the invasion began, the Russian president stood before cameras and publicly acknowledged something he had avoided at all costs, that Russia was paying a price. What made this moment extraordinary was not just where the strike landed, but how it was executed. This was not a blunt show of force. It was a precise operation built on intelligence, patience, and deep penetration of Russian defenses. Western monitoring agencies had been watching the preparation unfold quietly, tracking subtle changes rather than dramatic announcements. Ukrainian units did not boast. They did not telegraph their intentions. Instead, they disappeared from expected positions, reduced visible communications, and allowed familiar intelligence signals to go dark. To experienced analysts, that silence spoke volumes. For months, Ukraine's operations had followed a discernible rhythm. Targets inside Russia were carefully selected, almost conservative in their logic. Energy infrastructure supporting military logistics, weapons storage facilities, air bases feeding the front lines. The strikes were effective, but they maintained an unspoken boundary. Moscow itself remained off limits. That restraint shaped Russian assumptions. It reinforced a belief inside the Kremlin that Ukraine either could not or would not cross that line. That belief proved fatal. In the days leading up to the strike, unusual patterns began to emerge. Reconnaissance activity intensified in regions that did not align with previous targeting behavior. Long-range systems were tested in ways that suggested adaptation rather than escalation. Units known for complex operations vanished from intelligence maps altogether. Then, 72 hours before the explosions, communication channels that had been consistently active fell silent. Veteran observers understood exactly what that meant. Ukraine was preparing something that could not afford detection. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, that preparation revealed itself. Residents in central Moscow reported multiple blasts in rapid succession. Within minutes, videos surfaced online showing smoke and flames rising from areas disturbingly close to Russia's most guarded symbols of authority. This was not a stray drone drifting off course. This was not a failed interception. The strikes were deliberate, timed, and accurate. Initial assessments underestimated what had occurred. Some analysts believed Ukraine was sending a message rather than inflicting real damage. That interpretation did not survive long. As intelligence reviews deepened, it became clear that multiple high-value targets had been hit, including facilities operating under civilian cover that played a role in military coordination. The implication was chilling. Ukraine knew not just where to strike, but what those locations truly were. When a country at war demonstrates the ability to identify concealed military infrastructure inside an enemy capital and strike it cleanly, the consequences extend far beyond physical damage. It shakes confidence. It fractures internal narratives. It forces leaders to confront vulnerabilities they have spent years denying. That is exactly what happened next. The Kremlin's response was not defiance. It was not theatrical outrage. It was hesitation. For hours, state media delayed its usual messaging. Emergency protocols were activated quietly. Air defense systems around Moscow were raised to levels not seen since the earliest phase of the conflict. And when Vladimir Putin finally appeared, his tone was notably restrained. He labeled the attack dangerous and escalatory, but then he crossed a line of his own. He admitted that Russia had suffered losses. That single word carried enormous weight. For 3 years, the Russian leadership had carefully curated an image of control and resilience. Setbacks were reframed, failures were ignored, costs were externalized. Acknowledging losses signaled more than damage. It suggested uncertainty, and uncertainty inside the Kremlin is rare. Behind the scenes, the implications were even more severe. Ukrainian intelligence confirmed that the operation had been planned over an extended period, designed specifically to exploit blind spots in Russian defenses. Communication nodes linking leadership to frontline commanders were disrupted. Logistical coordination centers believed to be invisible were exposed. The strike was not about spectacle. It was about demonstrating access. What Ukraine showed was not just reach, but knowledge, the ability to see through layers of concealment, the ability to time an operation so precisely that defenses could not adapt, the ability to strike without resorting to mass destruction. That combination is what terrified Russian security officials. It meant this was not a one-off event. It was proof of capability. More importantly, it shattered a psychological foundation of the war. Moscow had been framed as untouchable, a place where daily life could continue untouched by the conflict. That separation served a political purpose. It kept the costs abstract. It kept fear contained. In one night, Ukraine erased that separation. The war arrived in the capital, not as rumor or propaganda, but as sound, light, and smoke. And once that threshold is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. The shockwaves from that night did not stop at the edge of Moscow's skyline. They moved inward into the institutions that had convinced themselves this scenario was impossible. Inside Russia's security apparatus, the realization set in quickly and painfully. This was not simply a breach of air defenses, it was a breach of confidence. The systems designed to reassure leadership that the capital was protected had failed. And worse, they had failed silently until the moment it was too late. Military analysts began reassessing assumptions that had gone largely unchallenged since the beginning of the war. Russia had invested heavily in layered defenses around Moscow, not just physical systems, but overlapping bureaucracies meant to prevent surprises. What Ukraine exposed was that complexity does not guarantee effectiveness. In fact, it can create blind spots. Ukrainian drones and support systems navigated through corridors that Russian planners believed were adequately covered. Interceptor aircraft were scrambled only after targets had already been struck. By the time the response became visible, the operation was over. Compounding the damage was the reported disruption of emergency communication networks inside the capital. For a brief but critical window, coordination between agencies was delayed, orders were fragmented, and situational awareness collapsed. That kind of disruption does not require long-term shutdowns to be effective. In high-pressure environments, minutes matter. Ukraine understood that, and they used it. Soon after the strikes, Ukrainian intelligence released detailed information outlining what had been targeted and why. Coordinates were precise. The language was clinical. There was no attempt to exaggerate or dramatize the results. That restraint was intentional. It conveyed confidence. It suggested that Ukraine was not improvising, but executing from a position of clarity and control. The message was simple and unsettling. We know what exists inside your capital, and we can reach it. This is where the operation moved beyond the military domain and fully entered the psychological one. For years, Russian citizens in Moscow had been insulated from the realities of the war. News from the front arrived filtered and distant. Losses were numbers, not experiences. Tonight changed that dynamic. Explosions heard from apartment windows have a way of bypassing propaganda. Fires visible against familiar landmarks do not feel theoretical, they feel personal. Former intelligence officials speaking anonymously described the moment as a rupture in the social contract Putin had maintained with the capital, stability in exchange for distance, normal life in exchange for obedience. That balance depended on the belief that the war would never come home. Ukraine shattered that belief in a single night. Inside the Kremlin, pressure mounted rapidly. Military commanders demanded explanations for the failure of defenses they had publicly praised. Security services launched internal reviews searching for leaks, collaborators, or systemic flaws. Economic elites, already strained by sanctions, saw new risks emerging, and ordinary citizens began asking questions that had previously felt unnecessary. If Moscow is not safe, what is? This is the environment in which Vladimir Putin now finds himself operating, a leader whose authority rests heavily on the perception of control cannot afford visible vulnerability. Yet vulnerability is exactly what was exposed. The acknowledgement of losses was not a slip of the tongue. It was a concession forced by reality. When denial becomes implausible, even the most rigid narratives must bend. History suggests that moments like this are dangerous, not because they guarantee escalation, but because they create emotional decision-making. Leaders under humiliation do not always act strategically. They act to restore image. They act to reassert dominance. They act to erase the memory of embarrassment. That impulse is what international observers are watching closely now. NATO's response reflected that concern. Statements were deliberate, carefully balanced to support Ukraine's right to target legitimate military assets while cautioning against disproportionate retaliation. The emphasis on precision was not accidental. It framed Ukraine's actions within legal and moral boundaries that Russia itself has repeatedly ignored. That framing matters because it shapes international tolerance for what comes next. At the same time, Ukrainian leadership did not celebrate recklessly. President Zelensky's address was calm, almost restrained. He spoke not of revenge, but of inevitability. The idea that distance no longer confers immunity, that support structures for occupation are valid targets regardless of location, and that Ukraine did not seek escalation but would not avoid it if required to end the war. These statements were not aimed solely at Russia. They were directed at allies, adversaries, and global audiences, weighing the risks of continued support. Ukraine was signaling that it remains disciplined even as it demonstrates expanded capability. That combination is difficult to dismiss and hard to counter. What further complicated the situation was that the strike on Moscow did not occur in isolation. Simultaneous operations unfolded elsewhere. Ukrainian forces struck military positions in occupied Crimea. Cyber operations disrupted command networks across multiple regions. Intelligence disclosures hinted at additional targets mapped and monitored inside Russian territory. This was not a single punch, it was a coordinated sequence. When multiple domains are activated at once, it signals a transition, a move from reactive defense to proactive pressure. Analysts began to speak openly about a new phase of the war, one defined less by static front lines and more by strategic reach. A phase in which assumptions built over years could no longer be trusted. For Russia, the challenge now is not simply responding, but doing so without compounding the damage. Retaliation risks validating Ukraine's strategy by escalating the very domestic consequences Moscow has tried to avoid. Restraint risks appearing weak. Investigation risks exposing internal failures that undermine confidence further. Every option carries cost. Meanwhile, Ukraine has achieved something rare in modern conflict. They have altered the emotional landscape of the war. Fear, once concentrated almost entirely on one side, has become shared. Uncertainty, once a Ukrainian burden, now exists in Moscow as well. That shift alone reshapes calculations. As more footage emerged and more accounts were verified, one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not an accident of war. It was a deliberate lesson, a demonstration designed to linger long after the fires were extinguished. Ukraine was not trying to destroy Moscow. They were trying to change how Moscow thinks. And thinking, once changed, cannot be restored to its previous state. What happens next will define far more than a single night of explosions. It will determine whether the assumptions that have guided this war since its earliest days can survive contact with a new reality. Ukraine's strike did not end the conflict, but it fundamentally altered its geometry. The idea that the war could be contained, geographically or psychologically, no longer holds. Once that illusion collapses, every calculation must be rewritten. Inside Russia, the immediate instinct is control. Control the narrative, control the investigation, control public perception before uncertainty spreads too far. But control is hardest to maintain when people have seen something with their own eyes. Videos recorded from balconies and sidewalks do not disappear simply because officials prefer silence. Sound carries, memory persists, and the knowledge that the capital can be reached cannot be unlearned. For the Russian leadership, this creates a strategic dilemma with no clean solution. Escalating attacks on Ukrainian cities may satisfy demands for retaliation, but it risks reinforcing the very message Ukraine intended to send, that this war now has consequences everywhere, that there is symmetry where once there was asymmetry, and that power, when used without restraint, invites answers that cannot be fully contained. At the same time, restraint carries its own danger. A muted response could be interpreted internally as weakness. It could embolden critics within the security services who already question the competence of existing defenses. It could deepen fractures among elites who have long supported the war on the assumption that their personal safety was guaranteed. The Kremlin must now choose between competing risks, each capable of eroding authority in different ways. Ukraine, meanwhile, has demonstrated something just as important as reach: discipline. The operation avoided mass civilian harm. Targets were selected for strategic value, not spectacle. Messaging was controlled, deliberate, and restrained. That discipline is not incidental. It is designed to preserve international support while expanding operational freedom. Ukraine understands that perception is a battlefield of its own. Western governments are watching closely, not only to anticipate Russia's response, but to assess what Ukraine's capabilities imply for the future of the conflict. The strike suggests a maturation of Ukrainian intelligence, coordination, and technological integration that exceeds many prior estimates. It raises questions about what other capabilities remain undisclosed and how Russia might respond if faced with further demonstrations of this kind. There is also the matter of deterrence. For years, Russia relied on the assumption that escalation thresholds would protect its core territory. That assumption now looks fragile. Deterrence depends not just on weapons, but on credibility. When defenses fail visibly, credibility erodes. And when credibility erodes, deterrence becomes unpredictable. This unpredictability is what makes the current moment so volatile. Decisions made under pressure, driven by pride or fear, can spiral quickly. That is why international messaging has been so carefully measured. Support for Ukraine is reaffirmed, but boundaries are emphasized. Warnings are issued without ultimatums. Everyone involved understands that the margin for error has narrowed. For ordinary Ukrainians, the strike carried a different meaning entirely. It was not about vengeance, it was about agency, about proving that endurance is not the same as helplessness, about demonstrating that suffering does not have to be one-sided forever. After years of missile attacks, blackouts, and destroyed neighborhoods, the knowledge that the aggressor is no longer insulated carries emotional weight. For ordinary Russians, especially those in Moscow, the meaning is more unsettling. It challenges a story they have been told repeatedly, that the war is distant, manageable, and controlled. That story was essential to maintaining normalcy. Now, normalcy has cracks, and cracks invite questions. None of this guarantees a specific outcome. Wars rarely pivot on a single event, but some moments accelerate forces already in motion. This appears to be one of them. Ukraine has shown it can impose uncertainty on a system that depended on certainty. Russia has been forced to confront vulnerability where it least expected it, and the international community has been reminded that this conflict is far from static. As the days unfold, investigations will continue, damage assessments will be refined, statements will be reinterpreted. But beneath all of that, a fundamental shift has occurred. The war is no longer defined solely by front lines and occupied territory. It now includes the psychological space once assumed to be protected by distance and power. What Ukraine demonstrated was not simply the ability to strike Moscow. It demonstrated the ability to choose when and how to change the rules. That is a form of leverage that cannot be bombed away. It lingers, it forces adaptation, and it reshapes expectations. For Vladimir Putin, the challenge ahead is restoring an image that has been punctured. For Ukraine, the challenge is using this moment without overreaching. For the world, the challenge is preventing escalation while acknowledging that the conflict has entered a new phase. One thing, however, is already clear. The idea of safe zones has collapsed. The notion that geography alone can shield power has been disproven, and the belief that this war could remain contained within predetermined boundaries no longer survives scrutiny. Ukraine reached the heart of Russian power and lived to show it. Moscow felt fear that had long been exported elsewhere. And a conflict that many believed had settled into grim predictability has become dangerous and uncertain once again. The night the Capitol burned was not the end of the war, but it may be the moment when everyone involved realized that nothing about this war is fixed, and nothing is beyond reach.